Hi, I'm Marc Mailloux. In my first book, called Discovery on the Kathmandu Trail, I wrote about the circumstances that led me, a French-Canadian Roman Catholic, to faith in Jesus Christ by way of India, and indirectly, of course, through the ministry of Drs. Francis Schaeffer and Os Guinness in L'Abri in Switzerland. I finally, in the April of 1973, met an Indian Christian who gave me a copy of the Gospel according to John, which I read for the first time while sitting on the banks of the Ganges River, and understood what the Lord Jesus says about himself. My second book picks up where the first one left off. In fact, after coming to saving knowledge of Jesus in India, I went to France in the fall of 1973. And I went to France partly with the idea of finding my roots. My ancestry was French, obvious from my name, and I was curious about knowing something more about the culture that I originally came from. I was under the mistaken impression, as many Americans are, that the French were Catholics and that France was a Catholic country, and that's a mistaken impression, as I say, because in fact only 6% of the French people claim to be practicing Catholics, and they incidentally define practicing as someone who would attend Mass once a year. So my first impression of France was somewhat of a shock. I arrived in France, as I say, in the fall of 1973 with the first goal of learning the French language, and there's a certain irony in that, because even though I was a pretty good student at school, I was the worst of the class always when it came to languages. I just had no natural proclivity for learning a foreign language. So the idea that I should have to go and study in France and eventually share the gospel with the French, who are, as many people know, obsessed as the use of their language. Any of you have seen My Fair Lady, you recall that Professor Henry Higgins says that a Frenchman doesn't care what he says so long as he pronounces it correctly. I wasn't the right man for the job, but as the Apostle Paul says, my strength is made perfect in weakness. God gave me the grace. Meanwhile, I checked with an American pastor before going there, and he reassured me by telling me, he said, listen, if the Lord can get Balaam's ass to speak in Hebrew, he can get you to speak in French. And basically that's what happened. I started out studying then in Paris, and in the summer of 1974 I did a 6,000-kilometer bicycle tour around that country. It's the most beautiful country that I know of. I met many interesting people and was overwhelmed by the beauty of the countryside, but I was equally shocked by the spiritual destitution of the French, especially in a country with so many beautiful cathedrals and such a rich Christian heritage. Now, I don't have time in this short film to tell you about French Christian history, but it's possible that the Apostle Paul himself may have stopped in Marseille on the way to Spain if he ever made it there. We know for a fact that there was a thriving Christian community in Lyon in France, called Lugdunum back then, in the 2nd century. Some of the famous church fathers, Irenaeus and Potin, were in that church. And we know as well that in spite of the relative obscurity of the faith in the Middle Ages, when the French were building these magnificent cathedrals, there were people like Bernard de Clairvaux who really loved the Lord and who understood the gospel message. But as I say, unfortunately, the folks in the Middle Ages did not have Bibles, they didn't have the printing press, so there was a lot of bad theology as well, for sure. Finally, in the Lord's providence, he allowed a certain John Calvin to come along and it explained to the French people the true meaning of the gospel, and then the Reformation started in France. The Huguenots were the French Protestants who came to the faith, and they were severely persecuted, unfortunately, by many of the French kings, especially by Louis XIV, who, as any French schoolboy can tell you, reigned from 1643 to 1715. Louis XIV particularly took it upon himself to extirpate this foreign religion, as he claimed, from his kingdom. He said there should be un roi, une loi, une foi. One king, one law, and one faith. In spite of that, the Huguenots continued to subsist in the underground in France. They were particularly persecuted in a period that the French refer to as the Desert, between 1685, when Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had been designed by its proclamator Henry IV to protect the Huguenots, to give them some kind of measure of liberty to worship as they saw fit. The Edict of Nantes, revoked, as I say, by Louis XIV in 1685, and it became officially open season against Bible-believing Christians, or Protestants, as the French, Huguenots as the French call them, until 1787. In fact, the French have the dubious distinction of being the only people to have had the gospel to the extent that they did and to have rejected it. Meanwhile, they replaced the gospel with this whole movement we know as the Enlightenment, starting by people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire and Montesquieu. And this whole movement that led up to the French Revolution, of which the motto is Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity, which sounds very nice, but in fact it sounds like the gospel without Jesus Christ, or what the Apostle Paul would call another gospel. And that's probably one of the best explanations that I know of. The fact that the French beat up on so many of the Lord's children in the 16th century, the Lord has visited the sins of the fathers on the sons to several generations of those who hated him. And that, as I say, as best as I can, explains why France is in such a destitute state. I began myself studying the Bible in France at seminary at Aix-en-Provence, at the Faculté de Théologie Libre d'Aix-en-Provence in 1976. Stayed there for 5 years. My vocation for that country was a package deal. I met my wife there in the fall of 1976. We have 3 children. And we spent, after graduation, 3 years working on the university campus in Lyon, and another 10 years in the Marseille region, trying to plant a church in the southern part of the city, and then first in the northeast part of the city. What can I tell you about the French themselves? Well, you'll have to read the book, but you might resume their whole character with Jean Cocteau's remark, who said that a Frenchman is by definition an Italian in a bad mood. Or as Jay Leno put it, the difference between Disneyland France and Disneyland in the United States, that is, in Disneyland France, all of the 7 dwarfs are named Grumpy. The French generally don't have the joy of salvation, and that probably explains a lot more about their, you might say, grumpy attitude than anything else. On the other hand, they're fascinating people. They have very distinctive attitudes about work, healthcare, politics, sports, religion. All of these are included in my book. It's important that we get the gospel back to the French because we owe the French a lot. I remind you that the most mature expression of our Reformed faith came from a French lawyer, Jean Calvin. But in addition, think of our political liberty, which we owe very much to the likes of Rochambeau and Lafayette. And at the same time, the French Huguenots who fled France during the persecution and went to Switzerland, to Holland, to England, and eventually to the United States. Paul Revere was from Huguenot origin up in Boston. John Jay, our first Supreme Court Justice, was from Huguenot. 30 of the American presidents apparently had Huguenot blood. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was from Huguenot origin. Even Walt Disney, whose family was from Normandy, d'Issigny-sur-Mer, the name of the town where his family came from. So we're indebted to the French. The book has a lot of amusing anecdotes about the French. I think it will at least amuse you, hopefully edify you. It's available at Amazon.com, as is the previous book, Discovery on the Kathmandu Trail. Thank you for your attention in watching this.